All right, so let's wrap up this last set of notes for our Industrial Revolution. So we started this unit with the Agricultural Revolution and we ended up in the Industrial Age. And looking here at the very top, the industrialization reaches continental Europe. So we know that it begins in England. And we actually discuss at the very beginning why England and nowhere else. And that's because we understand that the rest of Europe was pretty much dealing with war and unrest due to that age of revolutions. So England focused on industrializing because they had already experienced that back in the 1600s through the English Civil War all the way up through the Glorious Revolution. But after England, the first country to industrialize in the continent of Europe is Belgium. Belgium is the first one to industrialize after England. And England wasn't always willing to share their secrets and their ideas, but eventually they do share a little bit, with Belgium, which is understandable due to how these two areas are very connected with each other. And Belgium was the one that helped them move through that agricultural revolution. The next country to follow after Belgium would be Germany. And for England, this nation is going to become a problem because by 1871, Germany will be able to rival Great Britain economically and with the Navy. Other parts of Europe will start to develop industrialization during the mid-1800s, and it is a slow process in some areas. One of your homework questions asked you guys, how were the effects of industrialization uneven across Europe? Well, looking at that map on page 205, hopefully you were able to see that Europe is divided into two economic zones. The industrialized core that had a higher standard of living, so they had that, spendable income they could do on things that they want to do instead of just focusing strictly on the necessities, and versus the less industrialized area. And hopefully you're also seeing that there is a difference between the West and the East. The West, we're going to see more industrialized, higher economic zones than we see in the East. And that's going to play out when we get into imperialism along with World War I. Those countries in the East are really going to struggle in a war that is based on industrialized might. Moving on to the philosophers of the industrialization. And we're really looking here at reactions to the effects of industrialization. I mean, we've talked about in section 1 and, for our first two sections, the negative effects of industrialization, the hard impact it has had on the working class, but also the great benefit that it has had on that growing middle class. So we look here at a group of economists, and this is, capitalism, this free market economy, this economic system that Adam Smith had brought us during the Enlightenment, and it has been strongly embraced in countries that are strongly trying to become industrialized. So they believe there's a natural law, just like we had back in the Enlightenment, natural laws that govern things. And Adam Smith introduces us to this idea in The Wealth of Nations that there are natural laws that would govern the economy, that you need to have a free market system, that laissez-faire, this economic theory, that there needs to be a hands-off approach with the government, that you need allow progress to occur with the people, that they need to follow their own self-interest and not have regulations, that in the end, everything would work out. There would be competition would be between businesses, and that would end up being good for the consumer with that competition. And we see that today. There are products that you can get in one store that's also available in another. You're going to price shop. You're going to look at quality. And for Adam Smith, these things need to play out. And if I want to create a new lotion line out there, I should be allowed to do that. And I should be able to have it produced however I want. And I should be able to stick it on the market and set up the price and not have interference. And if Mr. Bookmeyer wants to compete with me, he can be able to do the same thing. And we should not have that interference with the government. But it will be geared toward our supply and our demand and what the consumers are wanting. Now, Malthus another economist, and his ideas, when we look at Malthus and Ricardo, they have theories that can back up Adam Smith and kind of explain why there is a little bit of negativity that's coming out of this capitalist system. For Malthus, he wrote an essay on the principle of population, and he pointed out that population tends to increase faster than the food supply, but we have had in history population control, and that's through wars and epidemics like the plague, the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War. And we kind of talked about that in the beginning when we were looking at the agricultural revolution. Well, now we are in a time period where those things aren't happening. And it's not to say that there aren't wars happening, but we're not seeing wars that are lasting for 116 years and taking a large chunk out of the population and destroying land and economic and political systems. We're just not experiencing that during this time period. And they're pointing out that due to this, don't expect handouts from the government. That if you are having issues with taking care of your children, then don't have the kids. That you're the one who needs to control that. That if you can't feed them, then you shouldn't have had them. And you knew that going into your marriage, into that relationship. And don't expect the government to come in and bail you out. Ricardo will piggyback off of this issue with the population. And he points out that, hey, as long as there is a large population of laborers, then you are going to have, low wages. You're going to have the fact that you're going to end up with that competition, and those kids that you're having end up becoming your competition for those jobs, and they are cheaper labor than you are. So we look here at this iron law of wages with Ricardo, and this, that there will always be a permanent underclass. There's always going to be poor. And if you have a lot of workers and a lot of resources, you're going to end up with cheap labor and cheap resources. And the wages are forced low as population grows. Well, when we first had the outbreak of the plague back in the 1300s, it wiped out a large portion of the population, and the peasants were able to use that to their advantage. And so they were able to get concessions and some changes and some increase in pay. So it definitely worked to their advantage with a chunk of the population, removed from the Black Death. Well, now we're in a period where that's not happening. And so we're pointing out that this is just a reality of the situation. You have a large population, you have that workforce. It's not on your side to negotiate. So you're going to have the low wages, and you're going to have, more people than you can actually feed. So you might want to control the population yourself. Don't expect the government to bail you out. But then there were some people who did not support these ideas of capitalism because they really saw kind of like Malthus and Ricardo as like the doom and gloom guys. Like, well, that's just the reality of it. Can't do anything about it, but live with it and move on. But the socialists are going to say, no, there has to be something else. You know what? Laissez-faire is not working. The fact that the government's not intervening, that it is actually hurting a group of people. And what socialism was hoping that could be achieved was that you would work with capitalism, that they favored a government effort to improve people's lives. Work with capitalism to make these improvements, because they saw that the middle class, that the industrialists weren't doing anything to try to help their workers or the lower classes, that they needed kind of like a nudge, a little elbow to move along that path. So you do have some socialist reformers. You have a people who create the utilitarianism, where they believe that, you should judge ideas based on the usefulness for society, that we should constantly maintain that idea of progress. And, progress was one of those terms that we brought up in the Renaissance. We brought it up in Enlightenment. And really, it's how are we viewing progress? Because the capitalists are going to say, progress, look at all the changes we've made. We are living in the age of progress. But then your utilitarian groups are going to say, yes, but how useful is it for all of society? That you need to look at all of society and not leave a group behind. So you have these different perspectives looking at what is industrial age doing for us as people, for society as a nation. One is seeing the growth and how they're going to be on top, and the other one's saying, oh, but what about the people here? And here the socialists are saying the government really needs to step in and bring in some controls that can achieve some kind of social and economic equality or equity within the system. Now, Karl Marx will take us to a whole different level because socialism is trying to work with capitalism, trying to fix some of the flaws. But Karl Marx, in his book, The Communist Manifesto, and it's not a very big book at all, it's quite small, introduces us to communism, which takes socialism, what they say, to the purest level, or sometimes we refer to it as Marxism because it's coming from Karl Marx, the author, with Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto. What Karl Marx believes is that the problems of industrialization can't be solved by reforming. We just can't reform the capitalist society. According to him, it's just straight up evil. You can't fix it. You can't work with it. It's evil. And he points out that if you look historically, the class that has always held economic power, the class that has held the wealth, controls the government. He says, look all the way back to feudal times to present. You can always see that class that holds that economic power controls the government. And even looking at the present day of the industrial age, that upper class, the aristocracy, are struggling to maintain that political control because the wealth is now starting to grow within that middle class. For Karl Marx, he wants to point out that lawmakers are passing laws to help the capitalists increase their profits. They're protecting their property. They're protecting them from the working class. And he says, really, what you see in society is a class struggle. And it's a class struggle between the haves and the have-nots. The haves are your bourgeoisie, the middle class. They're the ones who control all productions of the goods, and they own most of the wealth. They are benefiting off of the working class or the proletariats, the have-nots. They're the ones who do all the labor, and they receive no rewards for it. Kind of like the political cartoons you would see for the French Revolution, where you would have the peasant bent over and the upper class is riding on their back. He's kind of alluding to that here, that everything that the haves have, the bourgeoisie have with their wealth and all the means of production, is being built off of the backs of the have-nots, that proletariat, the working class. And this is like the first time he's like introducing us to that word, the proletariat, having a proletariat revolution. And they're being exploited. Now, for Karl Marx, he sees that our class system, where we align economically, defines who we are, that it will always keep us so divided and separated. And we're going to see how that's not going to be the case. World War I is going to throw that theory right out the window. So for Karl Marx, his solution, the proletariats must rise up and lead a revolution, a proletariat revolution. The working class comes up and they are going to seize control of all means of production and the government and destroy the capitalist system. So when you look at a spectrum, you have capitalism on one side and you have communism on the other. They are complete opposites. One sets out to destroy the other, and the other sets out to destroy their opposing group as well. And we're going to see this play out between countries that embrace communism versus countries that embrace capitalism. But one thing that we are never truly going to see are countries that fully embrace communism. Because according to Karl Marx, through this proletariat revolution, once the workers rise up and take control over the government, the means of production, destroy the whole capitalistic system, then the working class would equally distribute everything. And we would end up in a classless society. No more social classes. And because we are in a classless society where one group does not hold economic power over the other, then there is no reason to have a government. Because, if we look up here, he says the government's there to protect the benefit of the people who hold all the wealth. Well, if we are all equal, then there is no reason for a government to even exist in a true communist society, and the government would wither away. What we're going to find in countries that take Karl Marx's ideas, or I should say people who take his ideas and lead a communist revolution, they never, get to a classless society where the government withers away. Once they take control over the government and seize the means of production, they don't want to give that power up. And they will say that the people aren't ready. The people aren't ready. So we're going to see this play out. The first country we're going to see it play out in will be Russia. And that's going to take place during World War I. Your second question asked you, what issue divided pure Marxist socialists from the revisionists? So your pure Marxist socialists believed that a violent revolution was necessary, that proletariat revolution, while the revisionists want to work within their own parties. They want to take a slower process and look for ways to make the reform. When we look at our proletariat revolutions, our communist revolutions that's going to start off in Russia, they're going to go for the violent route. And we're going to see that even within that group, we will have Bolsheviks and we're going to have Mensheviks. Your Bolsheviks are going to say they are embracing that pure Marxist mentality, where your Mensheviks are going to be your revisionists who are like, okay, let's break this down and take it a little slower. Now, the next page here is just bringing you a little extra comparison. It was just providing you another way to look at all of this stuff within a graphic organizer. So the problems of industrial revolution, and then the different views on that. Your capitalists, your Marxists and socialists, and then your other social reformers, and then the solutions. And that takes us to my next set of notes looking at the solutions that come about. So the age of reform. So looking here at our social changes and reform bills. I mean, yes, it's going to take some time, but Parliament does start to increase democracy in Great Britain. And see, for Karl Marx, he didn't envision that would even happen. He did not think that, they're going to make these changes and actually start to give the lower classes a voice within the government, allowed to have a position, be able to vote, and start to see some changes. One of the changes that they made was the Catholic Emancipation Act, that they actually started to open the government offices to Catholics. They had shut Catholics out of the government back with Bloody Mary Tudor. When we were looking at all of those changes with Henry VIII and his wives and his children and all the religious turmoil, clear back then, they don't allow Catholics back in the government offices until the Catholic Emancipation Act. This was great for Ireland because now the Irish are going to have seats within Parliament, and they're hoping they can start to make changes that will benefit Ireland. And this is also going to help in areas, if they have, some industry, they start to get a voice. But for Ireland, this was a game changer for them. The Reform Bill of 1832 opens representation in those industrial cities. I mean, it's amazing, some of the things that did come out that was beneficial, but now they're like, hey, look at these cities, look at the size of them, the representation, they need a voice. And it also, if you see here in 1832, your upper middle class men are now going to be granted the right to vote. Not the lower or the working class, but in 1832, we are starting to see The aristocracy is going to get a little bit of a nudge. The upper middle class men, they now have the right to vote, so we'll start to see more changes. In 1838, we have a group called the Chartist Movement. They issue the Charter of 1838, which is demanding and requesting reforms that they want to see happen. They would like to see universal male suffrage, that all men, regardless of their social standing, should have the right to vote. And when that vote is granted, it should be by secret ballot, so that someone who falls in the lower middle class or the working class is not going to be intimidated or swayed to vote a certain way, that it is private. And when you go, you become old enough to register to vote, you're going to see that we do practice with a secret ballot. So voting is by secrecy. So you are not in that position to be intimidated to vote a certain way. Also point out they need to put an end to property requirements for serving in Parliament, because that's excluding people, excluding a group of men that some would believe that, hey, I think they would be a good representative. And how about let's actually pay members of Parliament? Those MPs should receive some kind of income, because when Parliament is in session, they are pretty much walking away from their lives. So if they have jobs, they have to walk away from that job. That income is not coming into their households. So if there's someone in your community, in your town, in your village that you want as your representative, they have to be willing to go, if they are chosen to go. And some are going to say, no, I can't leave my family without this income. So they're recommending you really need to provide an income for when they are there working and have to walk away. And then holding annual elections. Someone's not doing their job, remove them, vote them out. So people don't get comfortable and not fulfill the promises that they made in order to become that member of Parliament. So I have an arrow here pointing from what they wanted to how Parliament responds to these demands. Queen Victoria was not supportive of the Chartist movement, and she's also not going to be supportive of the push for women's suffrage. She definitely saw a lot of issues with some of the demands that the people were bringing to the forefront, because they weren't always necessarily quiet or peaceful when they were presenting their ideas publicly. But Parliament eventually does respond, and we see in 1867 they have another reform bill, and this time the working class men. So by this point, by 1867, you have all middle class men can vote, and now working class men can vote. We have the secret ballot in 1872, which is very beneficial particularly when the lower class men are voting, so they're not being persuaded to go a certain way or intimidated. And then in 1884, the rural workers, the people working in the countryside. And this isn't applying to the aristocracy, the large landowners, but the people who work their land. The men now have the right to vote. They also are going to address child labor. And this was something that a lot of middle-class women jumped on board with. There are some social issues that they believe needs to be addressed. They were very supportive in the quest for their husbands to gain the right to vote, and they were hoping that, particularly with the right to vote and some of those husbands actually gaining seats within Parliament, that they could really use that in order to make changes socially. Factory Act of 1833. So we start to see that we are adjusting the age for when kids can work. So no child under the age of 9 can be employed, and they are restricted with certain hours of work. The Mines Act of 1842 says women nor children can actually work underground. They can still work for mining companies, they just can't be sent underground due to the dangerous conditions. And then the 10 Hours Act, again, looking at this is for women and children and limiting the amount of hours that they can work. And when you go through it, then it's going to be for kids. They'll start to address particularly ages. Some other issues that women are going to tackle, a group of Quakers are going to pursue William Wilberforce, who is a member of Parliament, because he was someone they thought, he's very eccentric. He definitely looks at societal issues and he brings things before Parliament. And one of the big things that they brought to him was the abolition of the slave trade. And there's a movie out there called Amazing Grace that actually goes through the process. It goes through William Wilberforce and his position within Parliament, and then the steps that they had to go through in order to get the issue on the table, the clash they received from the people who were benefiting financially from being a part of the slave trade, and then how they actually will turn it around and make it unpatriotic because they're at war with France, and we can use this to go after France. But in the end, the slave trade, English does abolish the slave trade under William Wilberforce. And please note, and I put here in green, this did not abolish slavery. It abolished England's participation in the slave trade, and it gave them actual permission to go and attack or seize ships that were transporting slaves, and they could take the bounty of all the other stuff that was on the ships as well. But it definitely is that movement of moving toward eventual abolishment of slavery. But right now, under Wilberforce, it is the abolishment of the slave trade. Women also got involved in creating of settlement houses. And these are organizations that actually would provide services to rural workers, the poor in the cities, providing health care, education, childcare, employment resources. So really trying to lighten that burden for the working class families, for working class women. Education reform. And as you go through looking at the education reform, you start to see that education will need to be open to all social classes, and that it needs to be required for all children. And even within that education reform, where you start to get breakfast and lunches provided at school. So the fact that lunch and breakfast is provided available for you at school, it starts way back here in the industrial age with the education reform, because once they get the kids into the building, then they needed to also provide some other necessities for them. And also prison reform, making those changes. We had back in the Enlightenment with the ideas that we needed to improve our justice system. Well, prisons were an area for cruel and unusual punishment, still continuing even during this age. And depending on why you're in prison and how much money you had, depends on which level of the prison you were sent into. Charles Dickens shared in his works that you would have to pay to go into the prison to see someone, and then the guard would make you pay in order to leave after you visited. So definitely saw that the prison system needed reform. Women. The WSPU, Women's Social and Political Union, they really campaigned strongly for women's suffrage. They were out there disrupting political speeches. They marched on Parliament. They bombed buildings. They burned down railway stations. They went on hunger strikes. They did everything they could to try to draw attention to themselves to gain women the right to vote. Unfortunately, at this time, the decisions that they were making in order to get their voice heard was actually going against their cause, because the men in Parliament were pointing out that, still that same mentality that women could not think rationally, so they should not be granted that right to vote. And the fact that they're bombing buildings, they're burning down railway stations, and these hunger strikes that they were going on. I mean, women were starving themselves. Parliament ended up passing laws that made it illegal to go on hunger strikes. And the women would be arrested and they were brought in, and then they were force-fed through tubes that they shoved down their throats. And then once they could get the nourishment back in their bodies, and then they would send them home, and the vicious cycle would start all over again. The women were trying to take a stand, but they were also doing severe damage to their bodies in the process. What we will see is that when World War I erupts in 1914, these issues that seem to be dividing people within all these industrialized countries will be put on the back burner. The differences between the social classes, back burner. The idea that women were fighting for the right to vote, on the back burner. Nationalism is what's going to unite the people. They are going to be willing to put this stuff aside and deal with it later in order to unite, to support their nation, to support the soldiers who are going to go off to fight and defend their country against an oppressive nation. So that was one thing Karl Marx did not see. Nationalism and religion, those are areas that are a lot stronger than our economic differences. So let's see here on this last page, looking at worldwide effects of industrialization. It's definitely going to promote colonization. We had talked about using other resources, and eventually in some instances, we're going to have a depletion of resources. How are you going to get that? Because industrialization is not going to stop. They pretty much have seen a cash cow here, and they see the enormous benefits of becoming an industrialized country. So they're going to need more resources, and that's going to take us into our next unit, imperialism. They're going to go into non-industrialized countries and start to strip them of their resources. So we're really going to see that gap between industrialized and non-industrialized countries really begin to widen. And unfortunately for the non-industrialized countries, they're going to be colonized. Now for the industrialized world, we are going to see that economic ties are going to start to strengthen between some countries. In some instances, we are really going to see how some countries that may not have always been on friendly terms, like France and Great Britain, will start to work together. They become frenemies, enemies who can find a common ground, a little bit of a friendship. And they can also see that maybe they have common enemies, like Germany, another economic nation, where there's going to be a little bit of a clash and start to take us into that world war. So in this set of notes, we were able to cover your homework questions 1 and 2. You'll need to venture now back to our week 2 folder to see the rest of the answer key for the homework that you had that was due on Wednesday. Again, a reminder that your test is due by 11:59 on Friday, and the test has been available to everyone since Wednesday. All right. Have a good day, everyone.